Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're unpacking a really fascinating, exhaustive look at lunar and Martian exploration. For decades, the main story we've been told about pushing into space is all about manifest destiny, engineering triumphs, and these boundless new frontiers. But as setting up a permanent presence on the Moon and Mars shifts from sci-fi movies to actual logistical reality, well, a massive, highly polarized divide is popping up. So we're going to look at the vast amount of literature pushing humanity toward the stars, and the surprisingly robust counter-narrative pushing right back.
Let's just dive right in with a question that honestly feels kind of sacrilegious to ask in our era of daily rocket launches and billionaire space races. Does humanity actually belong on Mars? It's a super provocative question, right? And it perfectly sets up the tension we're exploring today. On one side, you've got space expansionists who believe leaving Earth is our cosmic imperative. And on the other, a growing chorus of critics who argue that settling space is an expensive, dangerous, and morally fraught fantasy.
To really understand this debate, we first have to look at the status quo. Part 1. The thesis. The expansionist imperative in the space literature landscape.
The evolution of Martian fiction brilliantly illustrates just how deeply this expansionist urge is wired into our culture. Long before we actually had the rocket thrust to reach orbit, literature was basically running simulations of the journey. It created this powerful cultural scaffolding that validated the aerospace engineering that would come later. Think about it. You can trace this right from Jules Verne back in 1865, straight through H.G. Wells making Mars an active, living theater of existence. Then boom, 1950 hits, and Ray Bradbury is exploring the complex allegories of colonization. And that leads all the way up to Kim Stanley Robinson in the 90s, who handed us these meticulously researched, scientifically plausible blueprints for terraforming. This whole lineage of science fiction, it didn't just entertain us, it actually generated the socio-cultural momentum needed to secure funding and political will for real space programs. It framed expansion as our inevitable destiny.
Now, when you dig into the nonfiction and advocacy literature, you'll find four core, goal-oriented justifications that advocates use to push for lunar and Martian settlement. First up is the scientific imperative. This is the idea that a human geologist standing on the ground can do in a few days what it takes robotic rovers literally years to pull off. Second, economic abundance. Advocates argue that mining the Moon and near-Earth asteroids will eventually eradicate resource scarcity right here on Earth. Third is geopolitical hegemony. Programs like the Artemis Accords, they are fundamentally about setting up the legal and operational rules for resource extraction before competing powers can dictate those terms. And finally, number 4, existential risk mitigation and utopian rebirth.
That last point brings us to what is probably the most emotionally potent argument in all of pro-space literature, heavily championed by advocates like Robert Zubrin and Gerard K. O'Neill. The argument really boils down to simple math. A single planet species is just inherently vulnerable to extinction-level events. Whether it's an asteroid strike, a pandemic, or total ecological collapse, the risk is there. So, in this view, Mars isn't just some giant science project, it's humanity's ultimate life insurance policy. Plus, it's framed as a utopian blank slate, a fresh chance to reinvent human culture completely unburdened by Earth's historical baggage.
But while that expansionist view absolutely dominates our culture, there's a serious plot twist. Let's move to part 2, the antithesis, the architecture of dissent. The big takeaway here is that space skepticism is not some brand new internet phenomenon. It spans decades. Way back in 1964, sociologist Amitai Etzioni famously called the Apollo program a moondoggle, arguing that it was starving vital domestic and social programs of much-needed funding. And that exact sentiment echoed loudly through the 1960s civil rights movement. Leaders like Ralph Abernathy were out there protesting the billions being spent on space while poverty was ravaging American cities. This skepticism got expanded later on by historians like Gerard de Groot, who totally dismantled the revered mythology of Apollo. And it's still going strong today. Modern anthropologists like Savannah Mandel used ethnography to argue for a complete moratorium on human spaceflight, pointing to its capitalist and exclusionary motivations.
This perspective really humanizes the anti-space argument. The critical theorist Hannah Arendt issued this stark warning. The technocratic push to leave Earth threatens to fundamentally remove humanity from its earthly context. It's an incredibly profound humanist critique. It basically asks us to sit down and consider what we actually lose of ourselves when we sever our connection to the very biosphere that created us.
Now, here is where it gets super interesting. Notice how directly the critics flip the expansionist arguments totally upside down. Remember that backup planet idea we talked about? Well, political scientist Daniel Dudney conducts this rigorous analysis, showing that space expansionism might actually be more likely to cause human extinction than prevent it. He points out that the very infrastructure we need for space settlement, stuff like the ability to redirect giant asteroids from mining, simultaneously creates kinetic weapons of mass destruction. It's wild to think about. He warns of intense, potentially catastrophic conflict over orbital dominance. So rather than a utopian escape, space becomes a massive source of geopolitical peril.
And beyond the heavy politics, there's a highly pragmatic, purely scientific rebuttal to sending humans at all. Astronomer Royal Martin Rees and science writer Donald Goldsmith argue that human spaceflight beyond low Earth orbit is just a dangerous anachronism. When you compare the staggering costs of human life support, radiation shielding, and the real risk of biologically contaminating pristine environments, robots are just vastly superior. They're economically way cheaper, they're equipped with autonomous AI, and the best part, they don't need a safe ride home. The argument here is that our stubborn insistence on human exploration is driven by outdated romanticism, not actual scientific efficacy.
Then we get into the sociological and anti-colonial critiques aimed at the commercial new space movement. Scholar Mary Jane Rubenstein defines this whole vibe as astrotopia. This concept is a super helpful way to impartially explain the critique that billionaire-funded space efforts are basically peddling a techno-utopian messianism. Essentially, it's this blind belief that technology is going to be our ultimate savior. Critics argue that this corporate space race operates almost like a dangerous religion. It offers this otherworldly escape to a wealthy few, mimicking the destructive historical patterns of imperialism, all while seemingly abandoning a dying Earth.
Okay, real quick before we go any further, we need to draw a very strict boundary. The academic dissent we are discussing today is absolutely not space denialism. Legitimate skepticism of space policy gets frequently and totally unfairly lumped in with fringe conspiracy theories like people who believe the Apollo moon landings were faked. The authors we are looking at base their arguments on hard economics, orbital mechanics, planetary protection, and political science. They operate entirely outside the anti-intellectual realm of denialists who just ignore empirical reality.
So if critics are making such valid, rigorous points regarding economics, ethics, and safety, why is the narrative we hear every single day so overwhelmingly pro-space? Let's answer that in Part 3, the synthesis, the 99% disparity in our cosmic future.
The quantitative disparity in published stances here is, well, it's absolutely staggering. When you actually sit down and analyze the whole space literature ecosystem, we're talking biographies, engineering treatises, institutional histories, advocacy texts, and weigh them against the critical works we just discussed, you find a massive publishing gap. Approximately 98% of published space literature is explicitly pro-exploration. Meanwhile, the critical, anti-space literature, that makes up roughly 2%. 2%. It is a profoundly lopsided conversation.
So how on earth did this happen? Well, it boils down to some deep-seated institutional dynamics. Step 1. Historically, the social sciences viewed space as totally irrelevant to terrestrial problems. They effectively abandoned it as a forsaken frontier for social inquiry. Step 2. Because sociologists stepped back, that intellectual vacuum was filled almost entirely by aerospace engineers, astronomers, and sci-fi authors, and naturally, those demographics are inherently biased toward technological optimism and mission success. Finally, Step 3. As space agencies and corporations grew into these massive entities, technocratic gatekeepers marginalized the humanists and ethicists, often waving away their concerns as unscientific roadblocks to progress. All of this combined to create a massive, self-reinforcing echo chamber.
And this echo chamber gets seriously amplified by something cultural theorists call capitalist realism. This is a fascinating sociological phenomenon where society actually finds it easier to imagine escaping a dying Earth on a giant rocket than it is to imagine fundamentally altering our current economic and social systems to just save the planet we're already on. Think about it. Books that promise a thrilling, high-tech escape to Mars are inherently going to sell better and generate way more public hype than dense sociological critiques demanding we stay here and do the really unglamorous work of fixing our broken institutions. Space colonization offers an incredibly seductive quick fix to massive systemic crises.
Finally, the pro-space narrative is heavily bolstered by cleverly neutralizing the main economic complaint that critics have. Opponents always argue that space funding should be reallocated to solve problems here on Earth. But advocates counter this super effectively by pointing out a massive, almost comical, public misconception. When you poll the general public, people often estimate that NASA's budget takes up a huge chunk of the U.S. federal budget, sometimes guessing as high as 25%.
But in reality, it represents roughly 0.5%, half of 1%. By aggressively highlighting this tiny percentage, space advocates easily dismantle the most common everyday argument against space exploration. They successfully hold on to their dominance in the debate over Earth's resource allocation by arguing that the economic kickbacks from the aerospace sector far outweigh this tiny fractional cost.
So where exactly does this all leave us? The literature reveals a really profound ideological battlefield, where the two sides are vastly unequal in size. The expansionists have completely succeeded in framing solar system colonization as a scientific necessity, an economic goldmine, and basically human destiny. But those dissenting voices, the ones warning of exported inequalities, geopolitical weaponization, and biological risks, they serve an absolutely vital intellectual function. They demand rigorous answers, because the ultimate success of human expansion isn't just going to depend on the thrust of our rockets, but on our willingness to actually integrate these cautionary insights. Which leaves us with this final thought for you to ponder as you explore the literature yourselves. As we look to the stars, can we responsibly colonize the cosmos before we fix our broken institutions here on Earth? Thanks so much for joining us for this explainer, and keep questioning the universe.